Ma'am, if I were you, I'd check who touched that watch before accusing the woman who cleans your floors. The voice came from the far end of the ballroom, low and calm, but it sliced through the music sharper than the crystal note of a champagne glass. Every conversation stopped. Beneath a ceiling of gold chandeliers, where donors in black tuxedos drifted beneath soft amber light, billionaire Richard Whitmore turned slowly, disbelief hardening his face. In the center of the marble floor stood Naomi Carter, still in her dark housekeeping uniform, a silver cleaning cart beside her, one gloved hand resting on its handle. A moment earlier, Whitmore had held up his late father's heirloom watch case, empty now, and declared before 200 guests that someone on staff had stolen it. Then his eyes had landed on Naomi. The black cleaner who had been polishing the east corridor outside the private vault room. The easiest person to blame. Search her bag, he had said. And the room had gone dead still. Naomi could feel every stare like cold rain. The polished marble beneath her shoes reflected the ballroom lights in broken gold shards, trembling slightly because her hands, though steady to the eye, had begun to tighten around the cart handle. She had worked 12 years in buildings where powerful people rarely looked at her face. She knew what suspicion sounded like before it was spoken. She knew the subtle shift when a room decided guilt before proof. Security moved toward her, dark suits cutting through clusters of stunned guests. Somewhere near the orchestra riser, a woman whispered, "I knew something felt off about her." Another man adjusted his cufflinks and looked away, already embarrassed for a stranger he did not know. But Naomi did not lower her eyes. She looked at Whitmore, not with anger, but with something far harder to dismiss. Clarity. Earlier that evening she had noticed something no one else seemed to see. Ethan Doyle, Whitmore's trusted chief financial officer, lingering too long near the private exhibit room, his reflection warped in the silver trophy case by the grand staircase. She had thought little of it then. But now, as accusation thickened, the air like smoke, memory stirred. Richard Whitmore stepped closer, voice clipped, controlled, the kind of voice built in boardrooms where lives could rise or collapse in one sentence. "If you have nothing to hide, open the bag." Naomi glanced once at the worn canvas tote by her cart, carrying nothing more scandalous than a packed turkey sandwich, a paperback novel, and bus fare home. Yet humiliation had already been staged. That was the point. Not the bag. The spectacle. She inhaled slowly, hearing the faint hum of air conditioning through the ballroom vents, hearing glasses settle on linen-covered tables, hearing her own pulse steady. Then she spoke. "Before you ruin an innocent life, check your security feed." Several guests visibly stiffened. A trustee near the front blinked as if she had spoken out of rank. Even one of the guards hesitated. Whitmore's jaw set. "Are you telling me how to run my own security?" Naomi held his gaze. "No, sir. I'm asking you not to let pride make a mistake." Somewhere beyond the ballroom windows, rain tapped against the glass overlooking Fifth Avenue. In the silence that followed, a senior security officer touched his earpiece and glanced toward the surveillance office upstairs. And though no one in that room knew it yet, in the next few minutes a reflection trapped in polished silver was about to turn accusation into something no billionaire in that room had prepared for. The security office on the 32nd floor felt colder than the ballroom below, its fluorescent lights humming above rows of monitors that flickered with grainy black and white images from every corridor in Whitmore Tower. Naomi sat alone at the edge of a steel chair, hands folded in her lap, the faint scent of floor polish still clinging to her sleeves, while rain slid in silver lines down the narrow window beside her. No one had taken her bag. No one had apologized. They had simply told her to wait. Through the glass partition she could see Security Chief Marcus Reed leaning over a console, jaw tight, scrolling through footage frame by frame. Richard Whitmore stood behind him, motionless except for one hand resting against the desk, his knuckles pale against dark walnut. He had not looked at Naomi since they entered the room. The silence was heavy in a way grand ballrooms never were. It carried consequence. Marcus rewound the feed from the exhibit corridor at 8:14 p.m. Guests drifted past in tuxedos and evening gowns, blurred by the angle of the ceiling camera. Naomi watched the footage the way one watches a storm gather over open water, sensing something inevitable but not yet visible. Then Marcus paused. "Hold on." He enlarged a section near the trophy case. Reflections shimmered across the polished silver cup by the staircase. Distorted, almost ghost-like. Richard leaned closer. In the mirrored curve of the metal, a figure appeared near the private vault entrance. Not Naomi. A man in formal evening wear. Ethan Doyle. For a moment no one breathed. Marcus replayed it slower. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, reached toward the display room, then slipped something small into his jacket pocket. The room seemed to contract. Richard's face lost color, not from shock alone, but from the quiet violence of recognition. Trust turning inside out. "Run the next angle," he said, though his voice no longer held command, only disbelief. Another camera showed Ethan passing through the east corridor minutes later, brushing casually past Naomi as she changed trash liners near the service alcove. Naomi remembered that moment now, how his cologne had lingered too strong, how he had smiled too quickly. She had dismissed the unease because people in her world learned to dismiss instincts that complicated survival. Marcus shifted to a camera outside the executive archive room. This time the image was sharper. Ethan entering earlier that evening carrying a leather folio not listed on the gala inventory log. Marcus frowned. This was not just a theft. His fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling access records. Richard stared at the screen as if seeing his own empire from a distance. He was diverting attention, Naomi said quietly. It was the first time she had spoken since entering. Both men turned. Her voice was calm, almost reluctant. The watch was bait. Richard looked at her fully then, perhaps for the first time that night. Not as staff. Not as suspect. As someone who had seen what he had missed. Marcus printed an internal audit alert from the system. Unauthorized fund transfers. Shell accounts tied to Doyle. Numbers that made his expression harden. This goes far beyond the watch. Richard lowered himself slowly into the chair beside the monitors, as if the weight of wealth had suddenly become physical. Outside the office, thunder rolled low over Manhattan. Naomi rose, thinking perhaps she should leave now that truth had surfaced, but Richard spoke before she reached the door. "Why did you not say something earlier about Ethan?" She paused, hand near the metal handle. "Because people in my position are rarely believed when the powerful trust the wrong person." The word settled deeper than accusation ever had. Marcus looked down. Richard said nothing. On the nearest monitor Ethan Doyle stepped once more through frozen grainy footage, smiling at guests who did not yet know the room where his downfall had begun. By midnight the gala had dissolved into murmurs, departing limousines, and rumors moving faster than rain along Park Avenue, but on the executive floor the building stayed awake. Ethan Doyle had vanished before security reached the ballroom, leaving behind an abandoned champagne glass, a leather folio missing from the audit shelf, and a silence inside Whitmore Tower that felt more dangerous than panic. Naomi stood near the wall of windows in the security office, looking down at headlights sliding through wet streets 30 stories below, wondering why she had not been dismissed hours ago. Instead, Marcus Reed had asked her to stay. Richard Whitmore had asked her to stay. That alone felt stranger than accusation. On the central monitor, account ledgers scrolled in columns of numbers while Marcus cross-checked transfer routes tied to offshore entities. Every few minutes another layer surfaced, another quiet theft hidden beneath the obvious one. It was not one betrayal but many. Richard stood at the long conference table, jacket removed now, tie loosened, no longer looking like the untouchable man from the ballroom. He looked older. Human. He turned toward Naomi with a question that seemed to surprise even him. "When you saw Doyle near the archive room, what made you remember it mattered?" Naomi hesitated. She was unused to billionaires asking her how she thought. Because guilty people move like they are rehearsing being innocent. Marcus looked up from the monitor and almost smiled. Richard did not. He studied her as if adjusting to a reality where wisdom could come wearing janitor gloves. Then Marcus froze over a transfer log. Richard, look at this. 3 pending authorizations tied to Doyle required executive biometric approval at 1:20 a.m. If processed, millions would disappear before dawn. Richard stepped closer. He set a timed extraction. Marcus nodded grimly. And if he still has remote access, he may trigger it from outside. For a long second no one spoke. Rain softened against the glass. Somewhere down the hall an elevator bell chimed and faded. Naomi looked at the monitor, then at the archive camera layout still open from earlier. He will not run far, she said quietly. Not until he gets what he came for. Marcus frowned. Meaning? She pointed to a service corridor camera near the private records vault. If he left the folio, he plans to return for something else. Richard's eyes narrowed. The hard copy trust agreements. Marcus was already moving, dispatching 2 guards to seal the lower archive level. But Richard did something neither of them expected. He turned to Naomi. Come with us. She blinked. Sir. You saw what we missed before. There was no condescension in it. Only trust, fragile and new. Minutes later they moved through the dim executive corridor, polished floors reflecting recessed lights like strips of moonlight. The gala music was gone. Only the distant hum of climate control filled the tower. Naomi walked beside men who hours earlier had nearly ruined her, yet her heartbeat was oddly calm. Near the archive entrance Marcus signaled them to stop. The vault door stood slightly ajar. Richard exhaled slowly. Someone was inside. Through the narrow opening a desk lamp cast a pale wedge of light across old trust ledgers stacked in shadow. A figure moved beyond the shelves. Ethan. But. Before Marcus stepped forward, Naomi noticed something else. On the brass filing cabinet by the door sat Richard's heirloom watch, placed there deliberately, not stolen for profit but left like a message. A distraction after all. Richard saw it too and understood in a flash this had never been about jewelry. It had been about dismantling him from within. Marcus reached for his radio. Naomi touched his sleeve lightly. Wait. Her voice was almost a whisper. He may not be alone. And in the stillness that followed, from somewhere deeper inside the archive, another set of footsteps answered. The second set of footsteps was lighter, measured, almost careful, and for one suspended moment no one moved. The brass watch on the filing cabinet caught the dim archive light and threw a thin gold reflection across the floor like a warning line. Marcus Reed lowered his hand from the radio, listening. Richard Whitmore's breathing had gone shallow. Naomi stood still beside the vault door, senses sharpened in a way that surprised even her, the faint smell of old paper and leather binding drifting out from the archive stacks. Then a voice came from inside. You should not have come down here alone, Ethan. It was a woman's voice, low and controlled. Marcus frowned. Richard's eyes narrowed as recognition struck. Helen Mercer. His general counsel. The woman he had trusted for 15 years. Through the gap in the shelves they could now see them, Ethan Doyle and Helen standing over an open records case, documents spread under the desk lamp. Not fleeing. Working. The betrayal deepened so suddenly it felt almost quiet. Richard looked as though something inside him had physically recoiled. Marcus leaned close and whispered, there are 2 of them. Naomi's earlier warning settled with a heavier meaning. But before Marcus could call in backup, Naomi noticed something else. Ethan was not packing papers. He was searching specific folders. He is looking for the amended trust schedule, she whispered. Richard turned sharply. How would you know that? Naomi pointed to the labels visible from the shelf edge. Those blue binders are succession amendments. He is not stealing money now. He is trying to erase ownership. Marcus stared at her a beat too long, startled by the precision. Inside the archive, Helen spoke again. Once the transfer executes, the board will think Richard authorized everything. Ethan gave a dry laugh. By morning he will be defending fraud charges, not running a company. Richard closed his eyes briefly, the truth striking harder than accusation ever had. Not theft. A takeover. Marcus moved to step in, but Naomi caught his sleeve again. Wait. Her voice stayed calm. If they know we heard them, they destroy the papers. Richard looked at her. Hours ago he had ordered her searched. Now he was waiting for her judgment. Naomi glanced toward the old mirrored reference cabinet beside the vault entrance, its beveled edge reflecting a narrow angle deeper into the room. Use the intercom, she said softly. Trigger a building-wide fire protocol. Marcus blinked. That locks every archive drawer automatically. Richard almost smiled despite the tension, as if realizing she had just seen the move before he had. Marcus reached the wall console and keyed emergency containment. A soft tone sounded through the executive floor. Then a mechanical sequence hummed alive. One by one metal document drawers began locking with sharp clicks echoing through the archive. Ethan froze. Helen spun toward the sound. Marcus pushed through the door. Step away from the files. No one shouted. No chaos erupted. The stillness itself carried the force. Ethan's confidence cracked first. Richard, listen, this is not what it looks like. Richard entered behind Marcus, his voice colder than marble. Tonight I have heard that line too many times. Helen's posture stiffened, but her eyes betrayed calculation collapsing. Naomi remained near the threshold, half in shadow, watching the powerful unravel not through revenge, but exposure. Then Ethan looked at her, really looked, and a bitter recognition crossed his face. This was because of the cleaner. Richard answered before Naomi could speak. No. This was because of truth. For several seconds only the lock system clicked through the room. Then Marcus bent over the open ledger Ethan had been using in his. Expression changed. Richard, he lifted a final document from the file. A signature page dated 2 years earlier. Forged. Richard's own name used to transfer partial control already. This conspiracy had begun long before tonight. Richard took the page with trembling fingers. Naomi watched him realize the deepest wound was not what they had tried to steal, but how long deception had sat beside him at his own table. And as thunder rolled again beyond the tower windows, a thought moved quietly through her. Sometimes justice did not arrive with noise at all, only with the moment a lie could no longer breathe. The forged signature trembled slightly in Richard Whitmore's hand, not because the paper moved, but because his certainty had. For years he had believed threats came from competitors across polished boardroom tables, never from the people who stood beside him in those rooms. Yet under the pale archive lamp, betrayal looked ordinary. A pen mark. A familiar signature. A lie aged by time. Marcus Reed quietly secured the documents while 2 additional guards escorted Ethan Doyle and Helen Mercer from the archive without struggle, their silence now heavier than protest could have been. Naomi watched them disappear down the corridor, and for the first time that night, the tension inside her shoulders loosened, though not into relief. Something larger was still unsettled. Richard remained staring at the forged page. 2 years, he murmured, almost to himself. This began 2 years ago. Marcus looked over the audit printouts. Possibly longer. The words landed with a dull finality. Then Marcus stopped turning pages. His brow tightened. There is another transfer sequence. Richard looked up sharply. What do you mean another? Marcus pointed to a pending authorization buried inside the trust amendments. At 6 a.m., when international markets opened, a final ownership trigger would move controlling interest through a dormant proxy unless manually revoked with the original founding key. Richard's face hardened. That key was destroyed after my father died. Naomi, standing by the vault threshold, looked toward the locked cabinet where the heirloom watch still rested. The same watch Richard's father had worn. A thought stirred. Maybe not destroyed, she said quietly. Both men turned. She stepped closer, studying the watch. You said it was an heirloom. Why display it in a private vault if it is only sentimental? Richard hesitated, then something old surfaced in memory. Because the winding stem conceals a micro key. Marcus stared. You are telling me the founding key is in the watch? Richard gave a slow stunned nod, as if hearing his father's voice across decades. He believed old safeguards were harder to hack than digital ones. Naomi exhaled softly. What had seemed bait in the ballroom had been the final target all along. Ethan had not stolen the watch because he had not yet extracted what was inside. But now time was narrowing. Marcus checked the clock on the wall. 2:14 a.m. less than 4 hours. We revoke the proxy now, he said. Richard moved toward the secure ledger terminal, but paused. The biometric console required 2 executive witnesses under trust law. Helen was compromised. Ethan removed. Marcus was security, not legal. A silence opened again. Then Richard looked at Naomi. The witness can be any employee of record in good standing. Marcus almost smiled at the irony before Richard added, if she is willing. Naomi blinked once. Hours earlier she had nearly been hand-searched under suspicion. Now she was being asked to stand as legal witness over a billion-dollar succession safeguard. I am a cleaner, she said softly. Richard answered with something close to humility. Tonight you have been more than anyone in this building with a title. They moved into the adjacent trust chamber where dark walnut shelves rose to the ceiling and old brass lamps cast pools of warm light over the original company charter. Richard opened the heirloom watch carefully, revealing a tiny mechanical key nested beneath the dial. Naomi felt almost afraid to breathe. Marcus entered override codes. Richard inserted the key. The console glowed blue. One final confirmation required witness verification. Naomi placed her hand on the sensor pad, the cool glass faintly lit beneath her fingers. For a heartbeat nothing happened. Then the screen flashed, proxy transfer revoked. Control secured. Marcus let out a breath he had been holding. Richard closed his eyes. Somewhere in the tower a hidden system reset with a low mechanical hum, as if the building itself exhaled. But as Marcus gathered the files, another alert appeared in red across the terminal. External board members had already received anonymous fraud accusations against Richard scheduled for morning release. The conspiracy had not ended with stopped transfers. It had only changed shape. Richard read the message, jaw tightening once more. Naomi looked at the rain beyond the narrow windows, now thinning into mist. The darkest hour had not broken. It had merely become quieter. And in that quiet, another battle was already arriving with dawn. By 3:30 in the morning the storm had thinned into a silver mist over Manhattan, and Whitmore Tower, once bright with gala lights and ambition, had fallen into an almost sacred quiet. In the trust chamber the red alert still glowed across the terminal, anonymous accusations queued for dawn release, a final strike designed not to steal Richard Whitmore's company now, but to destroy his name. Yet for several long minutes no one spoke of strategy. The urgency seemed to recede beneath something heavier and more human. Richard stood by the narrow window, looking out at the city lights blurred through rain, one hand resting against the glass as if steadying himself against more than fatigue. Marcus Reed stepped away to coordinate overnight legal holds, leaving Naomi alone with the man who hours ago had ordered her searched before strangers. The silence between them was not empty. It was changing shape. Naomi sat near the old charter table, fingertips lightly tracing the grain of the wood, feeling exhaustion settle into her bones. Her shift should have ended at 11. Her son would be asleep by now in their apartment in Queens, likely wondering why she had not texted goodnight. Strange how ordinary worries still survived extraordinary nights. Richard turned at last. "Why did you stay?" The question was quiet, almost fragile. Naomi looked up. "After you accused me." He gave the smallest nod. She considered before answering. "Because if lies were going to ruin you, I could not let lies ruin me too." The words did not accuse. They revealed. Richard lowered his gaze, absorbing something harder than blame. "I judged you because it was easy." Naomi said nothing. He went on, voice roughened by honesty and used. "My father taught me to distrust weakness. Tonight I confused dignity for weakness." Outside, a passing siren echoed faintly below, then faded. Naomi rose and stepped toward the window beside him. In the reflection she could see not a billionaire, not herself in a cleaner's uniform, but two figures altered by one long night. "People do that," she said softly. "They mistake quiet for powerlessness." Richard let out something close to a breath of regret. "And you still helped me." Naomi looked toward the first pale hint of dawn beginning beyond the skyline. Sometimes helping the wrong person become better matters more than proving they were wrong. The words seemed to settle into the room like warm light. For a long moment neither moved. Then Richard did something Naomi had not expected. He took off the silver access badge clipped inside his jacket, the Executive Ethics Review credential, and placed it on the charter table. "My father created an internal ethics office no one ever used. I buried it because I believed profit corrected everything." He looked at her. "Tonight profit nearly buried me." Naomi almost smiled, but before she could answer Marcus returned, carrying fresh printouts. "Board members are assembling at 7. We have a narrow window to stop the fraud release." Richard's old decisiveness flickered back, steadier now, but changed. "We do not hide," he said. "We confront it before they weaponize it." Marcus nodded. Then Richard surprised them both. "Naomi comes with us." Marcus did not question it. Naomi did. "To the board?" Richard met her eyes. "They need to hear from the person I nearly destroyed and who still chose truth." Her pulse quickened. A cleaner in a dawn emergency board session. It sounded impossible. Yet impossible had been unraveling all night. Marcus began organizing evidence binders while outside the eastern sky softened from charcoal to blue-gray. The city was waking. Naomi stepped once more to the window. On the glass her breath left a small fading cloud. She remembered mopping these executive floors after midnight for years, invisible except in reflections. And now she stood at the threshold of a room where her voice might shape what happened at sunrise. Behind her Richard gathered the forged documents and the heirloom watch, symbols of betrayal and trust now resting side by side. But just as Marcus shut down the trust terminal, a private line on the desk rang once, sharp in the stillness. All three froze. No one should have had that number. Richard answered. He listened without speaking, face slowly hardening. Then he lowered the receiver. "The press already has the fraud story," he said. "And they say a witness is claiming I ordered the theft myself." The dawn outside grew brighter, but inside the room the next trial had arrived before morning fully began. The private line's click still seemed to echo in the trust chamber long after Richard Whitmore set down the receiver. Outside, dawn pressed pale blue against the windows, but inside the room the air felt tighter, charged by a new kind of threat. A false witness. A public accusation ready for release before markets opened. Marcus Reed moved first, already sorting legal exhibits into a leather case, but his movements had sharpened with urgency. "If they frame you as orchestrator instead of victim, the board may suspend you before we present evidence." Richard did not answer immediately. His gaze rested on the forged documents spread across the charter table, yet Naomi sensed he was weighing something larger than survival. Reputation. Legacy. Whether truth still had enough time to catch a lie moving at media speed. Then Naomi spoke. Who is the witness? Richard looked toward her. They would not say. Marcus checked a secure message feed and his expression darkened. Press speculation says an internal employee claims you ordered staff to stage the theft for insurance fraud. Naomi felt the absurd cruelty of it. The same accusation once aimed at her now turned upward toward the man who had made it. Falsehood circling back. But then a thought stirred. Internal employee, she repeated softly. Someone still in the building. Marcus looked up. Most night staff have gone home. Naomi's eyes shifted toward the service wing corridor beyond the trust chamber. Not all. Richard saw the realization at the same moment. Helen Mercer had legal access, but someone else had been present at the gala loading entrance earlier that evening. A junior facilities clerk Naomi had seen speaking with Ethan Doyle near the freight elevator. A man named Paul Simmons. Nervous eyes. Overeager smile. Invisible enough to be used. Marcus was already reaching for his radio. But Richard raised a hand. No more chasing people through hallways. He looked at Naomi. What would you do? Hours ago he would never have asked her that. Naomi considered, then pointed to the ethics review badge still lying on the table. Use the lie before it uses you. Marcus frowned. She continued. Call the board early. Invite press into the opening statement. If they expect scandal, give them truth before rumor hardens. Richard stared, something like astonishment moving behind his fatigue. Marcus slowly nodded. Control the narrative before dawn. Richard exhaled. We convene at 6. What followed moved with the quiet velocity of necessity. By 5:15 the executive boardroom lights glowed again over polished walnut and floor-to-ceiling windows washed in first sunlight. Board members arrived in overcoats and disbelief, summoned before breakfast into what they assumed was a corporate emergency. Some glanced at Naomi standing near the side wall in housekeeping shoes and wrinkled uniform, confusion flickering openly. Yet Richard entered not with lawyers flanking him, but with Marcus on one side and Naomi on the other. A geometry no one in the room understood. Before anyone could speak, Richard placed the forged documents, audit trails, and heirloom watch on the table. Before accusations reach you through the press, he said, voice carrying with a steadiness restored by ordeal, you will hear the truth from me. Then he did something none expected. He turned toward Naomi. And from the woman I wrongly accused before she saved this company. Murmurs rippled across the room. Naomi felt her pulse in her throat, but when Richard gestured for her to speak, she stepped forward. She did not speak like a cleaner pleading entry into power. She spoke like a witness to integrity. She described the silver trophy reflection, the vault archive, the forged transfers, the trust override. Facts, not drama. Silence deepened after every sentence. One elderly board member removed his glasses and stared at her as though re-evaluating the architecture of authority itself. Then the board chairman, a man known for skepticism sharpened over decades, asked only one question. Miss Carter, why help a man who publicly humiliated you? Naomi looked toward Richard before answering. Because justice that only protects the innocent you like is not justice. No one moved. Even the room's ventilation seemed hushed. And in that suspended stillness, something turned. Not merely opinion. Conscience. But just as the chairman began to speak, the boardroom doors opened. A receptionist stood breathless. There are reporters downstairs, she said. And someone else is demanding to testify. Marcus stiffened. Richard's jaw tightened. Who? The receptionist swallowed. Paul Simmons. And suddenly the final piece of the lie had walked into the building on its own. Paul Simmons entered the boardroom with the uncertain gait of a man who had rehearsed one story and arrived burdened by another. His maintenance badge still hung crooked against his jacket, rainwater darkening the shoulders though morning sun had begun to break across Midtown. Reporters waited downstairs, cameras gathering like storm clouds at the lobby doors, yet inside the boardroom no one spoke as Paul stopped near the threshold and looked not at Richard Whitmore, not at the board, but at Naomi Carter. There was shame in his face before he uttered a word. Marcus Reed moved closer, cautious, but Paul raised a trembling hand. "I am not here to accuse him." His voice cracked, then steadied. "I am here because Miss Carter was right." A low stir moved around the table. Richard did not interrupt. He only watched. Paul swallowed hard. "Ethan Doyle paid me to sign a statement saying Mr. Whitmore staged the theft. He said it was only to pressure a settlement. I believed him." He looked down. "Until I heard what happened upstairs." The board chairman folded his hands slowly. "And why tell us now?" Paul's answer came almost as a confession to himself. "Because she looked at me last night in the service hall and treated me like I still had a choice." Naomi remembered the moment. Passing him by the freight elevator while suspicion surrounded her, she had simply said, "Do not let fear make you belong to a lie." She had almost forgotten it. But apparently he had not. Paul reached into his satchel and laid a flash drive on the table. "There are voice recordings. Ethan discussing the proxy fraud. Helen Mercer too." Marcus moved fast, loading the file into the boardroom monitor. Static crackled. Then Ethan's voice filled the room, unmistakable, discussing forged transfers, the staged theft, and one chilling phrase that froze even the most skeptical director. "Whitmore will accuse the cleaner himself. His prejudice will do half the work for us." Silence followed the playback like a held breath no one could release. Richard closed his eyes once, not from humiliation now, but from the hard grace of truth arriving complete. The board chairman rose. At 80 years old his movements were slow, deliberate. "I have served this company 4 decades, he said, "and I have never witnessed corruption so calculated or integrity so unexpected." His gaze moved to Naomi. "Miss Carter, your courage preserved more than assets." Richard looked at her then with something beyond gratitude, something closer to reverence. But Naomi saw Paul still standing uncertain, waiting almost to be condemned. And in that instant the story could have ended in exposure alone. Instead something quieter happened. Naomi stepped toward Paul. "You can tell the reporters downstairs what you just told us." He blinked. "After what I did. Especially after what you almost did." Marcus looked at her as though watching mercy take physical form. Paul's shoulders broke with relief so visible it changed the room. A lie had been undone not by punishment first, but by a door left open for repentance. Minutes later the board voted unanimously to suspend Helen Mercer, refer criminal findings to authorities, and affirm Richard's control publicly before markets opened. But before adjourning, Richard stood once more. "There is one more matter." He lifted the dormant ethics review credential from the table. "This office was neglected because I believed character could be outsourced to policy." He turned toward Naomi. "If she accepts, I am appointing Naomi Carter Interim Director of Ethics and Internal Integrity." Audible astonishment moved through the room. Naomi nearly stepped back. Cleaner to Ethics Director in one dawn. It felt impossible. But the chairman smiled faintly. "I second it." The vote carried before Naomi found words. Then, from the windows, morning sun struck the glass towers outside and spilled warm gold across the board table, across the forged documents, across the woman once nearly searched as a thief. Yet as reporters gathered below and Marcus prepared the press statement, Richard leaned toward Naomi and said quietly, "There is something I still have not done." She looked at him. "What is that?" His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I have not apologized where I humiliated you." And Naomi realized the deepest redemption was still waiting, not in board resolutions or titles, but in a public act only he could choose to make. The press conference lasted less than 12 minutes. By the time the final cameras lowered and reporters drifted back toward the elevators, the sharp edges of scandal had already begun dissolving into something quieter, something almost reverent. Richard Whitmore had stood before marble columns in the lower atrium and spoken plainly, not with the polished distance of a billionaire defending himself, but with the gravity of a man stripped of illusion. He had admitted his error publicly before those who had witnessed it. He had named Naomi Carter not as staff, not as employee, but as the person whose integrity preserved what wealth alone could not. There had been no applause when he finished. Only stillness. And somehow that silence carried more weight than approval. Hours later the tower had returned to its weekday rhythm. Elevators hummed. Trading screens flickered on distant floors. Sunlight poured through the east-facing windows in long bars of pale gold, warming the marble that only the night before had felt cold as judgment. Naomi stood alone for a moment in the grand corridor outside the boardroom, one hand resting lightly on the silver cleaning cart she had not yet taken downstairs. The same cart. The same gloves folded on its edge. Yet nothing around it looked the same. Near the security desk 2 guards who once would have passed without seeing her now straightened almost unconsciously as she walked by. Not ceremony. Recognition. Marcus Reed stood in the open doorway of surveillance, coffee untouched beside a bank of quiet monitors, watching her with a small nod that needed no words. Down the hall Richard emerged from his office without jacket or tie, carrying the heirloom watch in his palm. He stopped beside her, and for a moment both simply looked through the tall windows where morning moved across the city in sheets of light. He placed the watch gently on the cleaning cart beside her folded gloves. A strange pairing. Inheritance and labor side by side. Then he stepped back. No speech followed. None was needed. Naomi touched the watch only once, a fingertip across cool silver, then closed the cover over the hidden key. Some things had served their purpose. At the far end of the corridor workers replaced floral arrangements left from the gala, lifting wilted white lilies and carrying in fresh branches of green. Their leaves caught sunlight and threw moving shadows across the floor. Naomi noticed how the shadows trembled with the air vents, soft as breathing. She thought of the long years she had crossed these halls after midnight while others slept, invisible except in reflections. Now those same polished walls returned her image differently. Not elevated. Simply seen. Richard turned to leave, then paused and looked back once. There was humility in the pause, and something else, a quiet grief for the man he had been before one accusation exposed more than theft. He gave the faintest nod and disappeared into the office. Naomi remained. Where she was. The building noise receded into distance. Somewhere a printer clicked. Somewhere an elevator bell chimed and faded. She lifted the cart handle and began walking the corridor, not hurried, not ceremonial, only the ordinary steady pace of someone returning to work. Will casters whispered over marble. Sunlight moved across her path in bands. As she passed the brass directory near the boardroom entrance, a maintenance clerk had already replaced a temporary paper slip beneath the ethics office line. Naomi Carter. The letters caught morning light. She did not stop to read them twice. She only kept walking toward the long corridor where windows opened to the river, where wind touched the glass with a sound almost like breath. And in that quiet movement, with no music, no triumph spoken aloud, justice seemed to remain not as victory, but as something gentler. A dignity that made no noise at all.